So we started off the last conversation with a video of Ron Paul. So let's play a clip of that and just, jog your memory.
But I do believe there has been a coup and it's been taken over. And if I want to just put the date in my mind. And anybody could pick probably any date in the last 100 years. But I have picked November 22nd, 1963.
What happened on that day?
That was the day Kennedy was murdered by our government.
Wow.
By the CIA.
Okay, so as I said, I want to talk about this 1963 coup and how I believe that we're in this, it's kind of like the last stage of this overall plan. But I had another really interesting comment and it leads right into the first part of the video. One viewer and your handle is just your name, man, so I don't know if you're cool with me saying it on here, and I don't know what the etiquette is. Anyway, the comment said that they believe that we have experienced 4 separate coups, 1913, 1963, 9/11, and then 2020. And in my opinion, this makes sense. However, I do believe that they're all in pursuit of one overall goal. Anyway, a lot of similar names and groups have been associated throughout this whole thing, which is insane considering we're talking about stuff that began well over 100 years ago. But we'll get to that in a second. Now, as you know, one of the things I like to do on this channel is try to break down these conspiracies and just show that it's not as ridiculous as most believe. And that's what we're going to try to do again. We'll break down each of them and just, we'll see what shakes out. But first, let's dive into some history. The idea of global domination has been around since, forever. You could go back to, we could go back to Genghis Khan and the Mongols, Alexander the Great, ancient Rome. Yes, I believe that this lust for controlling the entire world is seemingly as old as our sense of ambition. And, ingrained within our nature, if you will. Yes, you can disagree with that assertion, but it's true at the very least for the megalomaniacal and tyrannical figures who happen to control the levers of power. However, as time went on and as civilization continued to progress, the idea of global government became less about wartime conquering and more about bureaucratic control over the populace. Yes, it has evolved right alongside our political ideations. These structures of global governance seen in the world today are the products of a long trajectory shaped by historical failures and successes alike. This ideal of political cooperation among global actors in response to shared problems is not a new idea, but has only been embodied by concrete institutions in the last century. Attempts at global governance have always faced the hurdle of being tasked with solving humanity's most pressing and enduring challenges while respecting the circumstances of individual nation-states. And typically, because they can't find that balance, they tend to fall right into tyranny. Or, on the other hand, they never even intended to find that balance, and it's all about power. And I'm going to leave it to you on this one. You can decide what to believe. So let's read a little bit from the Global Governance Forum and see how they rationalize their position. And so, first up, they have early visions. And I quote, "Against the backdrop of episodic phases of political instability and violence, history is replete with calls for exploring alternative political arrangements or methods of organizing human affairs in a way that would be more conducive to the rule of law. For instance, in the wake of reoccurring devastating continental wars, the French cleric Charles Costel de Saint-Pierre called for the creation of a European confederation in his plan for perpetual peace in Europe." Now, from there, they talk about the League of Nations. So, acting on this model to remedy the nationalist maladies that precipitated World War I, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson championed the institutionalization of global governance. He sought to abandon isolationism in favor of a more robust engagement with the world. In his vision, and I might add, this is how they sell it, I don't think this is their main ambition. Anyway, their justification is as follows. Yes, they claim, and I quote, "The League of Nations would be founded on a moral principle. The universal opposition of military aggression, as such, whatever its source, its target, or its proclaimed justification," end of quote. And so the Warhawks didn't like that idea, I guess. Anyway, we'll get more into how Woodrow Wilson influenced modern politics in a moment. However, from there, they start talking about the UN. So from there, based off of Woodrow Wilson and Colonel Mendel House's plan for global governance, the League of Nations, the next iteration of this global system was none other than the formation of the UN. However, the UN had some issues and they reconsidered their approach between 1945 and 1947. Following the establishment of the UN, the global governance debate has continued to evolve. The key objective remains striking a balance between the need to ensure that the UN will be able to deliver peace and security and the need to retain powers at the national level in those areas where it made sense to preserve a large measure of national control. So as everyone on the global stage became dissatisfied with the UN Charter, and against the backdrop of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a group of intellectuals formed the committee to frame a world constitution. So this committee met from 1945 to July 1947 to discuss what a federal republic of the world might actually look like. Similarly, in October of 1945, they tried to imagine what this federal republic of the world would look like, again, at a conference in Dublin. However, neither the work of the committee nor the Dublin Declaration had any major immediate effect. Now, they do have one more section, looking ahead. And I quote, "Today we are again at a turning point. Multilateralism is under threat. Passions of narrow nationalism, however maladapted to a globalized world, are currently experiencing a resurgence in some quarters rather than receding. The future of global governance and perhaps of civilization itself," yes, a little melodramatic, but okay. Anyway, they say, let me just start over. "The future of global governance and perhaps of civilization itself depends on our ability to reconcile somehow political realism, the scientific facts of a limited planet under serious stress, and the hopes of finally achieving a just and intensively cooperating world." They go on to say, and I quote again, "Without reform in global governance, we risk a downward spiral of disintegration into an intensified anarchy of absolute national sovereignty in a globalized world, made more dangerous by our advanced technologies for destruction and the destabilization of the life support systems of our planetary environment." Oh, the lies, the lies. You know, they really like to paint a picture indicating that they're just looking out for our best interest, when in reality, the world that is forming around us is decidedly dystopian. So, I do see the logical argument regarding using global infrastructure to maintain cooperation and peace globally. You know, promoting dialogue instead of war, but in reality, the ones at the top are not concerned with this, and instead they just use this lofty rhetoric to promote their own agenda, which is, of course, total control. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's start with the first coup, 1913. And personally, I believe we're left with one question at the end of this section. Is it reasonable for us to assume that Woodrow Wilson was corrupted and used by the Rockefellers to initiate this global governance scam? A family who seems to be at the center of all U.S. tyrannical schemes, even to this day. You're going to see what I mean in a moment, but just keep this question in mind. So at one point, Woodrow Wilson actually apologized and claimed that he unwittingly destroyed his country, but by the time he realized it, it was too late. So it is pretty hard to tell what the truth is. So I'll ask you, was he used, manipulated, and discarded by the Rockefellers, or just trying to save face because everyone realized what he did? You decide. However, this also alludes to the fact that each coup we're going to talk about is in relation to one overall agenda, promoted and progressed towards this outcome by oligarchical families and corrupted bankers, but seemingly enforced through, intel agencies. Yes, those three seem to be the true levers of power within politics. So, December 23rd, 1913 will live in infamy. 3 days before Christmas, House members passed the Federal Reserve Act. Now, we should keep in mind that President Woodrow Wilson was a tool of big money. He was J.P. Morgan's man in Washington, and he signed the Federal Reserve Act into law straight away, and so did Congress. They passed it in the middle of the night, and most congressional members have not even read it. And, doesn't that sound like modern politics, huh? Now, even if they did read it, they wouldn't have understood it anyway, and that's because it was cleverly worded to deceive people. Only its creators knew its true purpose. Ellen Brown explained what happened as follows, and I quote, "In plain English, the Federal Reserve Act authorized a private central bank to create money out of nothing, lend it to the government at interest, and control the nation's money supply, expanding or contracting it at will." End of quote. Now, weeks before the Federal Reserve Act made its way onto the scene, the 1913 Revenue Act became law, and it imposed a federal income tax. So apparently, it was sold as a way to help the U.S. citizens. However, all of this just turned the truth on its head. And that's because it was providing a level of government control regarding the monetary supply that was unprecedented in American history. Yes, the truth always appears to be the polar opposite of what is being sold to us. After all, privately controlled Fed policy has been hugely destructive for well over 100 years. It is a financial weapon of mass destruction. Now get this, in 1910, 7 powerful figures met secretly. They did so on Jekyll Island. So, they had 2 bankers there to represent the Rockefellers and their financial interests. We had 2 more bankers to represent J.P. Morgan, and Paul Warburg himself represented the Rothschilds. No one was there to represent the actual citizens. Oh, how nice. So essentially, we could say that representatives for the Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan, and the Rothschild family actually planned the Federal Reserve System. And 3 years later, it became the law of the land. Congress acted unconstitutionally, and so did Wilson by signing it into law. So therefore, Congress and Wilson defrauded the public. They did so by granting Wall Street money creation power. Yes, they gave powerful bankers absolute monetary control. And so from there, U.S. and world economies changed, and they did so for the worst. Now, I personally believe that the former law professor Woodrow Wilson understood full well what he did, and he did it anyway. However, when it was too late to matter, he said this, and I quote, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its credit system, and our system of credit is concentrated. Therefore, the growth of the nation and all of our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction, and no longer a government by the vote of the majority, but rather we are now a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." End of quote. And so, I'll ask you again, was he used, manipulated, and discarded by the Rockefellers, or is he just trying to save face because everyone realized what he did? You decide. Now, okay, before we move on to 1963, I just want to highlight what some historical figures thought of bankers. For example, James Madison knew the dangers of letting bankers create money. History, he said, records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling money and its issuance. Now from there, Thomas Jefferson stressed, and I quote, "I sincerely believe that banking institutions are far more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies." End of quote. And yeah, I agree. So in 1791, the First National Bank of the U.S. was established, and it was based in Philadelphia. At the time, it was America's capital. Andrew Jackson called it a hydra-headed monster, and he called bankers vipers and thieves. So from there, let's talk about Abraham Lincoln for a second, just real quick. I find these quotes interesting because they undoubtedly knew about the dangers of central bankers, but somehow, those money men managed to slip through the back door anyway. He said, and I quote, "The money powers prey upon this nation in times of peace and conspire against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than a monarch, more insolent than autocracy, and more selfish than a bureaucracy. It denounces as public enemies all who question its methods or throw light upon its crimes." End of quote. And yes, a den of vipers and thieves, indeed. So, all in all, I believe we are facing a big problem with central banks. I know, what a brain-dead obvious statement that is. After all, the Fed is not federal, it has no reserves, and it's only one of 4 dominant central banks. The others include the Bank of England, the ECB, and the Bank of Japan. Now, on the global stage, we have the Switzerland-based Bank of International Settlements, which functions as a central bank for central bankers. It has been described as the unaccountable boss of bosses. Its final solution calls for establishing a global currency that it controls. Now, achieving that would assure ultimate money power, and this is taking form today as a central bank digital currency. Now, the central bank for central bankers in Switzerland is often described as the Tower of Basel. It has been scandal-ridden from inception. It's called the most exclusive, secretive, and powerful supranational club in the world. End of quote. Yeah, the central bank for central bankers is run by a handful of powerful central banks. They can make or break world economies, and they do so at a whim. So to finish up this section, let's come full circle with a final quote from Ron Paul. "A century ago, politicians failed to understand that financial panics were caused by collusion between government and the banking sector. Today, we know more. We know better. We know that the Federal Reserve continues to strengthen the collusion between banks and politicians. We know that Fed policy continues to reap profits from Wall Street while impoverishing Main Street. 100 years is long enough. End the Fed." End of quote. So, okay, with an understanding of what happened in 1913, let's move on. Now, as I mentioned earlier, after that, Woodrow Wilson moved on to this League of Nations idea. This occurred after World War I and directly led to the formation of the UN. Now, we have talked about this aspect before. Right around the same time as the League of Nations came into existence, the Council on Foreign Relations was also created between 1920 and 1921. So, okay, all of this led to what the Council on Foreign Relations calls the liberal economic order. For over 70 years, this system, the old quote-unquote New World Order, and what they also call the international rules-based system, well, that's what determined global politics and global economies. All it did was inch us closer and closer to this global totalitarian government, dissolving national sovereignty and dissolving proper political representation in the United States. Now, we do have to mention that the Council on Foreign Relations was always a tool for this agenda, which, by the way, that council was created by a series of shadow figures and families. Yes, the founding members of the Council on Foreign Relations included none other than the Rockefellers. And I quote, "David Rockefeller's heavy hand was visible in one of the most prominent U.S. foreign policy institutions, the Council on Foreign Relations. This influential think tank, which was founded in 1921, established itself as a key vehicle for Cold War capitalist politics, and Rockefeller himself sat on the board of directors and later served as its chairman. Now, there is also a story to be told about the global connections, that the Council on Foreign Relations has ties to global and predominantly British origins, making it seem like the council was set up to promote globalist ideals, which it was. Now, the story of the British connection to the Council on Foreign Relations may be traced back to George Peabody, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, Nicholas Butler, and Colonel Edward House, all of whom have been described as British loyalists. A secret society was established by Cecil Rhodes in connection with the Rothschilds, J.P. Morgan, Carnegie, and the Rockefellers. And on top of that, a highly secretive group called the Round Table dictated operations. Perhaps a topic for another day. Okay, so far we have talked about the history of the idea, how 1913 changed pretty much everything, the formation of the League of Nations, the Council on Foreign Relations, the formation of the UN, and the liberal economic order. Now, all of those have dictated global events for our modern era. So, okay, coming right out of World War II, the UN, this liberal economic order, and a newly formed intelligence operation called the OSS was formed. Now, if you don't know, the OSS was later renamed to the CIA, which of course brings us to 1963, the Kennedy assassination and the second coup.